All right, good evening. It's time for us to go ahead and jump back into our kind of a journey through the Bible, really focusing on the time period of the Old Testament thus far. Let's just take a moment and take stock of exactly where we are in the story. Make sure that we are remembering the timeline that we are creating and all of the events, especially the key events and the key places in this timeline. Really, everything begins with what?
Genesis 3.
Creation. Go just a little bit before Genesis 3. It is important that we start with creation. And that is which chapters in Genesis? All right, chapters 1 and 2. Now, what happens in chapter 3? All right, well, not Cain and Abel, but, okay, the first sin, right? So we might call this the fall, and that is, Genesis chapter 3 is what? Our first key passage from the Old Testament, right? So number 1, Genesis 3, and that is the fall. Remember, fall is a term that we use. It's not a term that's actually used in the text itself, just noting that sin enters into the world at this point. So then this really leads into, I guess we could call it the prologue of the Bible, which contains, if I say the prologue, how many chapters am I talking about? No? 11. Yeah, the first 11 chapters of Genesis kind of serve as the prologue. And in that time period, what stories do we have? All right. Yep, Cain and Abel and Noah's Ark. Remember, Cain and Abel is actually a part of which story? The Genesis 3 story. Remember, it's actually a part of Genesis 3. It extends. Genesis 3 and Genesis 4 are all tied together under the same toledot. Remember that phrase, that word that we used, which is kind of a marker in Genesis of the different sections. So Genesis 3, and then 4, you have Cain and Abel. Chapter 6 through 9, you have the Noah story. What else? Yeah, just say it. All right, you have the Babel story. And really, those are the driving narratives, and also a whole bunch of what? Well, genealogies. And that's what drives chapters 1 through 11. Then we enter into the time frame of the patriarchs. And who are the main patriarchs? All right, so you've got Abraham, then Isaac. Okay, well, Ishmael is part of that story, but as we follow the line of the promise, who's next? Jacob. And so these are the three that we would normally really think of: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And it's part of the Jacob story that we then conclude Genesis, really, with whose story? Joseph, the story of Joseph. And with Joseph and his narrative, this is how Israel comes to be where? In Egypt. They come down into Egypt, and what happens to them while they're in Egypt? They become enslaved in Egypt. It becomes a captivity for them. So they spend this time in Egypt. Does God bring them out? Yes. And who is the one who brings them out? All right, now we're in the time frame of Moses. What do we call this time period? All right, this is the Exodus. as they are departing and leave Egypt, God takes them to what place? Not quite yet. First, they go to Mount Sinai, and, we skipped one. Sorry. I'm going to back up just very quickly here. What was our second key passage? Genesis chapter 12. And what happens in Genesis 12? All right, you have the promises to Abraham, right? So, now we're getting to our third key passage. While they're at Mount Sinai, what is this one? All right, Exodus 24, and what happens in Exodus 24? Okay, he receives the tablets while he's there, but very particular in Exodus 24, what happens? All right, this is where they ratify their covenant with God. At this point, they become a what? That's right. They become a great nation at this point. So God leads them through the Exodus. Do they go straight into the promised land? What happened? Okay, they have to wander for how many years? 40 years. All right, 40 years. Why? Okay, they grumbled multiple times. Okay, Joshua just said they told God, they told Moses, therefore telling God they'd rather die where? In the wilderness than to go up into the land. And God said what? Fine, you can die in the wilderness, and your children will go into the land, right? So, 40-year time period passes, and then God finally leads them into the promised land under whose direction? Joshua. Yeah, Joshua what? Joshua. Yeah, okay, all right, so. Okay, so Joshua, now that he has his cast off, he can lead them into the promised land. Very good. And that creates now a time period after that generation of what? What do we call that next? That next series of generations or time frame? Yeah, this is now the time period of the judges. What's one word that you could use to encapsulate the story of the judges? Just say it. Failure. Yep. That's a good way to think of it. It's a time of failure. They failed to drive out the peoples of the land the way they're supposed to, and then they fail over and over by going into what? Idolatry. So, who are some of the major judges that we should remember? Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, not Abimelech. He said Abimelech with a smile on his face because he knew it would get a rise out of me. Not Abimelech. Abimelech is not a judge, remember. He's a poser. He shouldn't be in there. So, very, very well done, because it got the rise that he was looking for, because I immediately was like, nope, he got me. All right, so, not Abimelech, right? But who? Well, after Gideon, who's the next one? You probably said it, but I got sidetracked. Jephthah. Then, you've already said it, I heard it, but say it again. Samson, right? Those are the judges from the time period of the judges. And then, how does that go for them? Does that time go well? Yeah, it kind of gets worse and worse and worse and worse as you go. And really, Judges almost serves as an apology. Let me use a different word, because apology means something different to us nowadays. As a defense for a what? For a king. The time period of the Judges, it's like it's there saying, hey, we need to have a king, because Judges ends with what phrase? In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So that's the time frame of the Judges. And we have a couple more as you move into the next book, but they're not judges in the same sense that the time period of the judges were judges, right? Things have changed just a little bit. So they're outside of this book, narratively speaking. We turn the page, and now we come into whose story to start off? Did someone say it? Yeah? Oh, not Samson. We're past Samson, but it might be a Samuel, right? Yeah. So here comes Samuel now. He's right on cue. Yeah. So when Samuel comes onto the scene, he becomes the king maker, and he's the one who anoints the first two of the kings. Who are they? All right. So we come to the time now of the kingdom. And you have the first one is Saul. Tell me about him. Good king? He was the king that they what? All right, that's the king they asked for. Remember, the Hebrew name for Saul is it's derived from the Hebrew word for he asked. So he is the king. He's the one they asked for. And then God said, I'll give it to you. You can have him. Doesn't go great. Now it's my turn. We'll get the king I'm looking for. Who is that? All right, so then you have David is the next king. And how about him? Yeah, pretty good king. In fact, he is such a good king that from here on out, everyone else is going to be what? They will be compared to him. He is the standard. From here on out, were you like David or were you not like David? That becomes the standard by which it's determined. Which is crazy considering that we spent so much time talking about how awful of a person he was, right? Yeah, how he the whole thing with Bathsheba and Uriah, and with Nathan the prophet coming to him, all of that. But we concluded last week looking at the fact that it's not so much the actions that are done, it's what? The attitude of an individual, their repentance that they have when they come face to face with their sinfulness. When Saul was confronted with his sinfulness, how did he react? All right, very good. All that he was concerned about is what the people thought. He thought, okay, you got me, you're right, I've sinned. Can we keep this between us? Can you still honor me before the people so they don't know that I have been lowered in God's eyes? Is kind of the way that his scenario goes. What about David? How does David respond? Hold on one second. Let's give some other folks a chance here. You are nailing them, Joshua. But I'm just going to, yeah, Talia? Okay, all right. Yeah, when he's confronted, he says, I fully deserve whatever it is that is coming to me. In fact, so much so that he does what? Didn't I just say, hold on just a second, Joshua? Nah, you're good, bud. Yeah. What psalm does he write? Psalm 51. And you go and you read Psalm 51, and does it look like something Saul would write? The first king, does it look like something King Saul would have written? Not at all. That's why David is a man after God's own heart, and Saul is someone who lost the kingdom, right? Part of the battle at the end of 1 Samuel is when he was killed in battle. Exactly. So that's where we've ended with David. And I said that we would move into talking about the Absalom narrative and going through that. I've decided against that for the sake of keeping or getting back onto the flow. I'm going to skip pretty much the rest of David's career, and we're going to move on at this point. That's not to say that there isn't a lot of really cool stuff to talk about. In fact, just very briefly, can anybody kind of recount, and you don't have to give a lot of details, what happens with Absalom's story? And this is where we might need a mic here, whoever has the mic. Yeah, Isaac? Hey, Isaac, just remember, you just look and talk to me and let him position the mic for you, okay? All right, go for it.
Sister kind of got defiled
Okay.
because of her
No,
brother.
that's good. That's all we need to know. You can move on. We don't need those details, but go ahead.
So Absalom killed his own brother.
Yep.
And he ran to where his grandfather was king.
Okay.
Then he got back. He led a revolt against David. David had to go into hiding.
Mm-hmm.
Then Absalom's advisor hanged himself.
Okay.
Then there was a battle. Joab killed Absalom. The end.
All right. Well done, Isaac. Yes, nailed it. Yeah, you have all of those details and how this story progresses with Absalom. And I know Isaac could have given you all a lot more details because there are a lot more salacious details and things that are going on there that we're not going to worry about. You can go back and you can read through that yourself and spend some time. But what was one of the things that God had told David after the events with Bathsheba? Anybody remember? What about his house? All right, the sword would never depart from his house, from his family. And so it's almost the next narrative we get into that you find brother killing brother. Boy, does that sound familiar at all?
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah, where does that come, where else do you see brother killing brother, Joshua? Yeah. Yeah, Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel, which is the direct result of what story before it? Yeah, the first sin. That sinfulness then leads into these kinds of scenarios. So, all of that to say, I think we're seeing this type of stuff that plays out. But again, you can go and you can read through that and spend some time with that. What I'm wanting to do, though, is to move past David now and move into the next king. And is there anybody here by chance who has read forward that might know who the next king is? You've read ahead a little bit, so you know the next king is whom? Solomon, right? Yeah, so this has its own intrigue. Yeah, Solomon probably wouldn't have been the first choice to have been king based on lineage, age, who is what. There's somebody else who is crowned the king, and Solomon, but he's going to be, but Solomon preempts him, and you have all kinds of stuff. There's a little bit of a civil war that kind of takes place. Finally, Solomon emerges victorious. He wins the crown. He becomes the next king. So let's talk about then Solomon's reign. When you think of Solomon becoming king, what is the first thing that I'm going to guess pops into your mind? This is the reverse game, sort of. It's you playing the guess Chris's mind game who's guessing your mind game, right? So we got this whole meta mind game thing going on. So, all right, I'm going to let other people have a chance here, okay? What's the first thing that you think of when you think of Solomon becoming king? Josie, yell it out. All right. So I was reading Josie's mind. No, Josie was reading my mind, reading her mind perfectly. Yeah, everyone is familiar when he becomes king, right? God comes to him and says, I'll give you what you want. What do you want? And what was his answer? Wisdom. For what purpose? Why did he want wisdom? All right, to rule well. You know, he's like, I have no idea what it means to go out and come in. What does that mean, to go out and come in? That's a weird phrase. I don't know if I'm coming or going. Okay, it's a good guess. Not really what the phrase is, but yeah, Kelly?
How to act like a king?
Okay, how to act like a king, yes. In an overall principle, very specifically, the kings going out and coming in has to do with their military prowess. That they in the days that the kings go out to battle, the going out, the coming in, but it is just kind of a phrase that talks about everything, as Kelly said, associated with kinghood, kingship. How do I do this? And Solomon, he's like, I've no idea. He's fairly young, and so this is what he asked for, which demonstrates that even beforehand, what did Solomon have? What's that? Okay, humility, but what else? Wisdom. Josie, what you need? Okay, so Numbers 27:17. Yeah, Josie said Numbers 27:17 is a verse that talks about the leaders going out and coming in. Speaking of Joshua, who is going to be the replacement for Moses at that point, he would be the one that would be given the wisdom of going out and coming in. That is leading the armies out to battle and bringing them back in. Did I represent what you said well? All right, very good, Josie. That's a good reference to bring up here. So, it demonstrates Solomon's already got some wisdom to begin with, doesn't he? Because he could have asked for what? I mean, this is what God point blank tells him. He could have asked for long life, lots of money, things like that. And God says, I really appreciate the fact that this is what you asked for. You didn't ask for these other things. Therefore, I will what? I'll give you these other things. And once that happens, Solomon wakes up from his dream and recognizes this is what I have going on before me. All right, I want to look at 1 Kings chapter 4, and I want to read a couple verses here. In 1 Kings chapter 4, we're introducing Solomon's reign. We're spending a lot of time on Solomon and the things of Solomon. So, chapter 4 and verse 20, it says, Judah and Israel were as many as what? What's that? All right, as many as the sand by the sea. They ate, they drank, they were happy. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms, from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. What is this? As numerous as the sand of the sea, ruled over this space from the great river to the border of Egypt. Why do we have this information? All right, Jonathan just said this is the fulfillment, the recorded fulfillment of God's promises. Why? What promises? Yeah, Kelly? Oh, was that 1, 2?
Number 2.
Okay, so Genesis chapter 12. All right, in Genesis chapter 12, remember, he promised, what were the three main ones? All right. So, yep. All right. Nation, they would become a great nation. Nation would be given a land. And then through them, all the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth would be blessed. So what we now see, Genesis chapter 15, he says, count the what? Stars, so shall your descendants be. I think it's chapter 22, when he says your descendants will be as numerous as what? The sand that's on the seashore. So what we're seeing is that is, according to the author here, he is saying we've reached that. Is that a promise that they are future looking to see fulfilled? After 1 Kings chapter 4. No, it's done. You can check that one off. They are now as numerous as the sand of the sea. As far as all of the prophecies or the comments about their population, all of that, it's been completed. What's the other part? What's this promise? All right, this is the land promise, right? So we've got the great nation, and a nation that's great, as numerous as the sand at the sea. Now we have the land promise that was more specified, Genesis chapter 15, right? In that section, Genesis 15, he told them that they would have control, in the fourth generation they would return when the wickedness of the Amorite was complete and all of that. He gave them the parameters from the great river down to the river of Egypt, and that gets fulfilled here. This isn't just a random tidbit of information so that you know. This is a marker that is being placed right here in the Bible. Now that we're done with David's work, remember what David's job was? Why he couldn't build the temple? Because he was what? Okay. But what does that mean that he shed blood? Was it because he shed blood so he was disqualified? What does it mean? All right, his job was to finish the conquest of the land so that they would be fully planted and no more battle needs to be had because the fighting was over and God had planted his people firmly. Now we're on the other side of David. You have this marker planted in the Bible right here at this moment that says, I've done it. The people, the nation has been created. They are as numerous as I promised. They've been given the land. It's exactly what I told them. All we have left to do now is for this nation to serve me as I have outlined that they're supposed to serve me, so that what can take place? The blessing to the entire world will be done. That's all that's left. This should be a really short book. From this point onward, it should be really simple that they just simply bide their time. They become a beacon of God's light for the world. They be exactly who they're supposed to be until such a time as God brings the seed and blesses everybody. Is that how the story goes? No. When's it start going downhill? Kelly?
Towards the latter part of his life, Solomon violated the "you shall have no other gods before me" because he had too many wives, and it all went south.
We'll talk
from
about
there.
the particulars in a minute.
But the end of Solomon.
Yeah. It starts to go downhill right here. I mean, it's immediate that this becomes problematic. Now, before we get to that point, it is important that we remember what was Solomon's function. He was to do what? All right, his job is to build the temple. David wasn't allowed to because they hadn't been fully planted yet. They hadn't conquered all of the land. It wasn't finished. Now that it's finished, it's Solomon's job. And does he do it? Yeah. Is it a pretty nice place? Yeah, it really is. He does it, and he does it right, and he does it well, so much that Well, let me say this first. Exodus. Remember, once we got through the covenant in Exodus chapter 24, immediately, what's the next thing that God commanded starting in chapter 25? Goes 25 through 31. Do you all remember? Laws for the what? Y'all should have this one, a quick recall. There's God, basically they marry, then God's going to do what? Okay, then turn over to chapter 25 of Exodus and tell me, what are the laws for 25 through 31? The tabernacle, right? They enter into a covenant relationship with God. It's like they get married, and God does what? What's the point of the tabernacle? To have a home. Do we need to go back to 25? I thought we covered this one really well. Yeah. Why do they have the tabernacle? What's its purpose? What's its function? So that God can live among them. So that God can dwell with them. It's like they get married, they build this covenant, and God moves in. And he says, guys, I can't be with you unless you build me a house, just like your houses, so I can be there. And it has to be precise. And he says it has to be these things, built with this material, these dimensions, all of these things. The pictures throughout the tabernacle all take you back to what place? The Garden in Eden, right? You have the depictions of the tree of life and the food that's there, and God is there. And you have the altar of incense, but you also have the veil, which has the cherubim that keep people out and away from God. All of that is there, but God is living among them, so that once you get on the other side of the golden calf incident, starting in chapter 35 through the rest of Exodus, what is all of that? All right, Exodus 25 through 31 is the what? All right, it's the command for the tabernacle. Get on 32 through 34 is the what? Golden calf, right? So 35 through 40, the building of the tabernacle. Can you see how important the tabernacle is? That you have this number, 6 chapters here, or maybe 7, I can't do counting if you include the 1, whatever number that is spent detailing how many rings are to hold up a curtain. And I mean, so many things, who's to do what work and everything, that it details all of that. But it is so important that in a Bible, in a book that is very precise in the way that it writes things and it does things, it almost repeats verbatim things that are up here. And it doesn't do that unless it's trying to hit you overside the head by saying, this is incredibly important. I cannot understate the importance of what the tabernacle is for the people of Israel. So that at the end of chapter 40, how does it end? How does the book of Exodus end? No, it's actually very good. God moves in. How does he move in at the end of Exodus? What's it look like? The cloud comes down and it fills the tabernacle. And it says, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, and the cloud was so much that even Moses wasn't able to be there. This is the picture. God comes and moves in and lives with them. This cannot be overstated just how crazy and how incredible and how important it is that they have the tabernacle that God had given them. And it's chapter 40. It's so significant that the glory of God comes down as a cloud. It fills the entirety of the tabernacle so that everywhere there, everyone who's there can look to the tabernacle and they can say, God is with us. He's here. He is among us. But it's still just a what? It's still just a tent, which is why David, living in his house made out of cedar, he goes, this is not right that God is living here in a tent. I want to build him a permanent dwelling. And God says, you know what? I'll ask for a permanent dwelling when the conquest of the land is complete. When you finally finished driving out all the people and we're done with that, then will be the time for my permanent dwelling. Do you think it's just as important as this? Absolutely. Now, it's based off of dimensions, things that are in it, all that type of stuff is based off of the tabernacle, but it's expanded by quite a bit. What might you expect to happen when they've completed the temple? That God will move in. In what way? What would it look like? The cloud, the glory of the Lord comes down in a cloud. I don't know, maybe something like, and when the priests came out of that holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house. 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 10 and 11. Is that what we would expect to happen? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because God has already shown that's how he demonstrates his acceptance of the temple. He comes in with a cloud and he shows his glory to the people in that way. Yep, by coming down in a cloud and filling the house with that cloud. He does so in Exodus chapter 40, and then when Solomon builds his temple, he does it again. Which means that we are now conditioned. When there's a temple that's built, what is God going to do? That a cloud's going to come down and fill it with glory. And that might be important in the future at some point, because will there ever be another time that they might be building a temple? Will that ever happen again? Salt shakers here. Are they ever going to have to rebuild a temple? There's a whole book of the Bible that's kind of devoted to that, right? Down the road. And there's a whole prophet who talks about it. Yeah, well, we'll save that discussion till we get to that point. But tuck this one away. This is how God acts when you build the temple to demonstrate that he is there. He brings his glory. All right. Questions on this? Okay. All right. I want to go to what Kelly was saying. Yes. There's a hand. Somebody. I didn't. Oh, Dave. Okay. Hold on one second. The mic is almost there. Okay.
I was just going to ask if you were saying that 1 Kings 4 is one of your key passages.
It is not.
Okay.
It is not. It could be, because like it does demonstrate that what has been promised has happened. But I did fail to put one up there that we did talk about. What's the fourth one? All right, 2 Samuel chapter 7. What is that? Yeah, these are the Davidic covenant or the promises to David. And we referenced it. David said, I want to build your house. God says, no, I'm going to build your house. And then he gives this promise that shows that the line of blessing that starts with Abraham and expands to all of his family through Israel or Jacob has been narrowed down to now the line of Judah through David's line, as far as the people of promise that's to come. So that's the significance here. And we have just one more to come, and that one's going to be later. These have a tendency to kind of push the story forward, whereas 1 Kings 4 is kind of a place that says, hey, this has been done. And I think that would probably mark the difference. That's a really good question, though, because it is very, very significant. All right, I want to finish up talking about what Kelly was talking about before. And let's look at chapters 10 and 11. We're not going to read through all of this, but we are going to read just a little bit because I want us to see what the author of 1 Kings is doing when we get to chapter 10. Now, this is following the visit from the foreign queen who comes, and then it kind of goes into a picture of Solomon. So, 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 14, it says, the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Besides that which came from the explorers, from the business of the merchants, and all the kings of the west, and from the governors. So, is it okay if I just say that's a lot? Like, that's an insane, gross national product or whatever. I mean, that's unbelievable wealth that's coming in. What does he do with it? What does he do with all this wealth? Yeah.
Didn't he pretty much gold plate the temple?
Not the temple. Okay, he makes shields. Where are they going?
Palace.
Yeah. What palace? Huh? All right, his palace that's where? In Lebanon. Wait, hold on. What's the city of David again? Jerusalem. Oh, is Jerusalem in Lebanon? Oh, so this is a what? A vacation home. This is a second palace. This isn't even like his main palace. This is his second home, a second palace, this other place that's way over here, in the forest of Lebanon and all that. And he's like, I've got so much gold, I'm just going to, create a nice crib over here and, put this thing, so much gold, overlay everything with gold. Who benefits from that? It's only there for whom? For him. All this gold comes in to Israel, and he's like, I'm just going to put it in my house over here. Let's just make this place as fine and as nice as it can be, my second home over there, right? What could he maybe have done with it? Okay, well, you don't want to make a whole lot of armor out of gold per se. That would be more for ornamentation. But couldn't he have helped the livelihood of everybody in Israel? Yeah. Instead of what we're going to find out, and actually what's kind of talked about, is the way that a lot of them are treated, where he's kind of harsh towards them, and a lot of building projects that they have to fulfill and do. And we'll talk more about this when we get into chapter 12 and look at the stuff that the people say to the next king. But just remember this. He's accumulating all of this gold and this wealth for whom? For himself, right? Let's go down to verse 26. Solomon gathered together. Hold on, let me. Okay, hold on here. Wealth for self. All right, so that's our first thing that we have here. All right, let's go down to verse 26. Solomon gathered what? Chariots and horsemen. An incredible army right here. Keep in mind, when Pharaoh sent out his big chariot army, how many did he have? Anybody remember? Just yell it, Isaac. A little bit less? 600, yep. Yeah, he had 600 chariots, and that was unbelievable, to have 600 chariots to send out. Solomon's like, oh, you think that's something? Phew, that's nothing. I got 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen to go with them. Verse 28, where did he get those from? Go ahead and yell it out. All right, so from Egypt, right? So he has all these chariots and horses that come from Egypt. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now, King Solomon, what? Loved many foreign women. And let's see here. Verse 3, what does it tell us? All right, 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. Now, how does anybody have so many wives? Where do they come from? Yeah, Joshua just said other lands. A lot of times, if you are creating connections with various other nations or important people from various other nations, a really good way to formulate that connection is to send your daughter to their king. Why? Because now you're what? Now you're family. You're that king's father-in-law, right? It's a way of doing treaties, operating things, the stuff that they would do back then. Now, this is still pretty excessive, isn't it? Because he has many foreign wives. All right. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Anybody remember what's in Deuteronomy chapter 17? No, not the specific, because we've talked about Deuteronomy 17 before. What did we talk about Deuteronomy 17 before? All right, Deuteronomy 17 is very specifically the instructions for the king. Remember, starting verse 14, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you and possess it and dwell in it, and you say, I will set a king over me like the nations that are around me. Which means, is it wrong for them to say, I want a king like the nations around me? No. God says that's what you're going to do. And it's just fine for you to do that. He says, you may set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. Now, here's the thing. Verse 16, only, what are the things that he says he must not do? What's the first one? Huh? What's that? Say that again. No horses, right? He must not acquire many horses for himself, especially from where? From Egypt. What else? Okay. Not many wives Why? Lest his heart turn away. All right, so I'm just going to put heart up here. And then finally, what? All right, not a bunch of wealth. For whom? For himself. He must not acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Now, do any of these things over here look familiar? Can you... Horses from Egypt, have we seen that somewhere? Maybe right there. Many wives, right? Lest they do what? Turn his heart away. What about accumulating a bunch of wealth for yourself? Have we seen that? It's right up there, right? It's almost as if the author of 1 Kings is sitting there with Deuteronomy chapter 17 open saying, oh, by the way, let me tell you about Solomon. I've already mentioned all the other stuff, but now let me give you the proper evaluation of Solomon. And when it comes right down to it, what is Solomon's evaluation? Right? He has done every single thing that very specifically Deuteronomy chapter 17 says, do not do this. And the end result, especially of the foreign wives, which is why I think that you see the order changed, because the biggest impact of all of these in 1 Kings are the foreign wives. Why? Because why? Because his heart, right? Go back to 1 Kings and look at how this is described. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4, when Solomon was old, his wives did what? Turned away his heart. Right? That's right. I mean, that's straight out of Deuteronomy 17, right? His wives turned away his heart. But it's really interesting. And it says his heart was not what? Wholly devoted, or fully, I think the New American Standard says, or whatever. What does that tell you? Did he still serve Yahweh? I think he did. What was the problem? He didn't only serve Yahweh. He served Yahweh, but he also took these gods from these foreign women. So that his heart was devoted to the Lord, but his heart wasn't what? Fully, wholly devoted to the Lord his God. And that's okay with God, isn't it? I mean, as long as you do enough, as long as you got enough of your heart, I mean, he's doing the right things, I'm sure, right? Is that good enough? No. Ryan?
He's a jealous God. He doesn't accept half of a heart.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm going to come back to that phrase in just a second, because that's the perfect phrase to use right here. But I want to come back and say his heart was not fully, wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as was whose? His father David. Remember, David is the standard. David's the one that all of them are matched up against. So, verse 5, Solomon went after the Ashtoreth of the Sidonians, Milcom of the Ammonites. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord by not wholly following the Lord as David his father had done. You see, he did serve God. But when he served God, but he also served these other things, then his service to God became what? What does it say that he did? evil. His service to God becomes evil service to God when it becomes attached to service to all of these other things as well. And not that we have time to delve into it, but boy, there's a big lesson there, isn't it? If in our service to God, we also don't wholly devote ourselves to the Lord because we want to devote it to whatever else, maybe worshiping the almighty dollar or, family, events, activities, things that we do, whatever the case is, when our heart is not wholly devoted to the Lord our God. All right, we are really out of time here, but let me just end by this. Do you think this is going to end well for Solomon? Not really. And that's what we're going to get into next week, which we will definitely cover because it is an extremely important part of the narrative, is what happens. What does God do because of the way that Solomon acted? All right, we'll get into that next week. Thanks a lot for the class, guys.